Hi and welcome to this Vaadin UX Best Practices webinar. My name is Marlon Richert and
my name is Rolf Smeds.
Alright, and well, let's just dive right in, shall we?
Yes.
Alright, so our first topic of today is to highlight your primary actions. So Rolf, let us tell us why we should do that.
Yeah. So one of the typical usability problems we see in a lot of web applications is that different buttons for different actions are not distinguished in any way. So in the example here, you see a typical login form with a username field, a password field, and a button for logging in, another one for registering a new account, and a third one for requesting a new password. Now the problem with this view here is that each of these buttons look exactly identical, so the only differentiating factor is the caption. So in order to know which button to press, you actually need to read the caption of each button.
Well, surely we can do better than that, right?
We can. So the idea is that you basically apply a style name to the primary action, which is basically the button that you're most likely to want to press. In this case, obviously, that's a login button. So you apply a style name to it, and it gets a distinguished visual styling that way.
Yeah, okay, well, that's great. I mean, it already looks a lot better. I know now, like, hey, okay, that's probably where I should go. But on the other hand, I'm typing, right? I'm typing my username, I type my password. Like, don't I want to be able to just, press enter after that?
Sure. So what you should do is you should basically set a click shortcut listener, or by using the set click shortcut method, to bind the enter key to that button.
And then you can see that here. So set click shortcut, we used key code enter. So that means that when the user in this dialog presses enter, that activates the click event in the button, and your click listener will get invoked. And it's just as if they had clicked it themselves. Really easy.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next topic. The next best practice is label your buttons expressively. Let's have a look at why first.
Yeah. Well, so another problem we see a lot is in applications that have a form or a dialog that you close out of after you modified some data. And if you haven't explicitly saved your data before closing the dialog, a lot of the time the application will ask you whether you want to save your changes or discard them before closing the dialog. And typically that is done by asking, do you want to save your changes? And yes or no button.
But sometimes, like we see here.
Sometimes, however, instead of asking if you don't want to save your changes, the dialog will instead ask you if you want to quit without saving your changes. And again, present you with a yes and no buttons.
Yeah, and this becomes really ambiguous. Like, for example, if you're used in one application, I always say yes, and then you go to the other application, it's like, whoops, all my work is gone. Yeah. Or the other way around. So that's very bad practice. So let's have a look at how we could do that better.
Yeah. So what you can do is that you can, instead of just labeling your buttons yes and no, you can actually use captions that are descriptive of what is going to happen when you press those buttons. So in this example here, we replaced yes and no with save and discard changes. So that way you don't have to guess what yes and no means. You don't really have to read the message of the dialog to know what's going to happen when you press the button.
Yeah, and also, for example, suppose now that actually I didn't want to quit at all, and then, or maybe I wanted to quit and I didn't realize I had unsaved changes. So I might want to just cancel the operation, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe I need to, I didn't want to quit. I want to inspect where my changes were. So we added a cancel button as well. And so just like Rolf explained, you use action verbs, save, discard changes. So you can just look at the button and you know what it does. You don't even need to read the rest of the dialogue. And the same goes for cancel here. And notice here that, for example, the main question is, we have that in big font. And then just in case there's users who are just still not sure after this, they can read the smaller text that gives a little bit more explanation. But you have to make sure that right off the bat, the user can just go to the buttons and they potentially know what to do already.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to our next best practice, which is to design your forms to guide data entry. So let's have a look how we do that. Now over here we have a form. Well, it's a pretty typical form. I think you've seen something like that before. Oh, hey, look, it has a default submit button. That's really nice. Everything nicely aligned. So yeah, that's pretty clean. I guess we're done, right?
Well, it does look neat enough, but we can certainly make it better by simply changing the size of the fields so that they correspond approximately to the length of the data that you're going to be filling into those fields. So as an example here, the first name and the last name and most of the address fields are going to have to be quite long because names and addresses, like country and street addresses especially, can be quite long. So you should have long fields for those. But then again, age, for example, I mean, that's the 3-digit value max.
Yeah, well, I'm at least assuming that we're dealing with humans, right?
Yeah, exactly. So likewise, postal code. The longest postal code I've ever seen has been 6 characters long. So both of those can be kept quite short. And by making them shorter than the rest of the fields, actually helps the user to get a quick grasp, a quick understanding of what those fields are.
Yeah, we're giving them a little hint about what we're expecting from them over there. So in that way we are guiding their input into the form. And here you can see, so on the postal code field we're doing set width 6M. And those units, M units is the width of the capital letter M in your font, whatever font you're using. And the nice thing about that is that because it depends on what font you're using, if you replace this with another font, it automatically has the appropriate width. Or if you're increasing your font size, decreasing it, you don't have to mess around with pixels or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I'll notice also that an M, since it's one of the widest letters in most fonts, this will lead to a little bit more extra space than you really need, but that's good because that gives your user a little bit more room for editing. All right, and let's go to the next topic. How can we improve this even more?
Yeah, so the next thing we can do is to group fields that belong together and separate them slightly from fields that don't belong together. So in this example here, we've grouped together first name and last name, and we've also made sure that the fields are in natural order for the user. So obviously in most Western cultures, first name comes before last name, so they should be in that order. Then we have this postal address, the 4 postal address fields at the bottom. They're grouped together since obviously they all are part of the postal address. And they're also laid out in a configuration that corresponds to what you're used to seeing on an envelope. So it's basically a natural way for people to look at an address.
Yeah, so you can recognize this visually immediately. But also, for example, so not just within, not just group the things together that belong together and within the group arrange them appropriately, but also look at the ordering of your groups. So here, for example, age, we've chosen to put that after first name and last name because age is about the person. If you would have put that after the whole address block, it feels wrong. It's like, it's unexpected. You have to think twice when you see that, like, wait, so address age, the age of the address? Oh no, it's the age of the person. So you can avoid that by putting them in the right place. So even within one group things are related, but groups might also be related to each other. So keep that in mind when you make your forms. All right, next up, there's still one more thing that we can do over here.
Yeah. So if you have a form with where some fields are optional and some fields are required, you should make sure to mark the required fields as such, because first of all, it places a visual indicator next to the field caption, usually a red asterisk, that tells the user that this is a required field. And secondly, when you validate the form, you will actually get a validation error on that field if it's empty.
Yeah, so you kind of get that for free from the Vaadin framework, which is really nice. One thing you don't get for free, however, you might want to put there is like a little marker maybe somewhere, like in this case at the bottom of the form, could also be at the top, find a good place for it, where you show that an asterisk means required fields, because not all users might be aware of that.
Yeah.
Of course, should you just always do this, or?
Well, not really. I mean, if you look at this, go back to this form we had looked at previously. Let's assume that all of these fields are required. it would be kind of pointless to add the required field indicator on each one of these fields. It won't really help the user at all. It will just add clutter to the UI.
You will get asterisks everywhere.
Yeah. And so, and if in case one of these fields happens to be optional, like the age field in this example, you might not even notice that if all the other fields are marked with red asterisks. So in that case, it's better to not mark anything as required and instead indicate the single or few optional fields as such, for example, by mentioning that in the caption.
Yeah, and if you do want that validation functionality that Vaadin brings from the set required, you can still use that, but you can just use CSS to actually just hide the asterisks here, for example.
True.
All right, pretty good. Let's go to the next topic. And the next practice is to use input prompts where appropriate. Input prompts are great tools, very powerful, but with great power comes responsibility. So let's have a look at that. How do you use them responsibly?
Yeah. So first, let's explain what an input prompt is. So input prompts are these placeholder texts that are displayed in input fields when they're empty. So, for example, a very typical use case is in search fields, where a lot of times you don't really want to waste space by having a search caption next to the field, but instead you put the caption inside the search field as in form of an input prompt. And as soon as you type anything into that field, that input prompt text will disappear.
Yeah, and that's a great space saver. For example, if you have this search bar in a toolbar or a crowded corner of your view, or perhaps in a mobile view or whatever, right? And so you can just set input prompt and then put whatever text you want there. The text will be dimmed out, more subdued than the filled-in field. And once the user clicks there, it will just disappear, and they can just start typing and get on with what they want to be doing. Now that sounds great, but there are places where you shouldn't do that, right?
Yeah, it can get a bit problematic because you have to keep in mind that as soon as you type anything into the field, the input prompt will disappear and you won't see it again until you clear the field. So here, the example here is a bit of an edge case. We have a location field into which you can type either a street address or just a postal code or even just the name of a city. So this information is kind of like additional information in addition to the caption. So you could put it in as an input prompt, but you have to be aware that it does disappear. The user won't see it once you have typed something into the field.
Yeah, for example, like if this is a website for a store chain and you're just looking for like the nearest shop, this is that kind of form, and then you see a location, and then I can put all of these things. Good, I type the stuff and boom, I get the nearest stores. That's fine because you have an immediate feedback to the user about what their input does. But for example, if you have a long, complicated form and they're filling that out, and then they're, at the end of the form, they're checking their input, and then they don't see this anymore, so they can't think, or maybe I should have put something else than I did. No, because the info is all gone. So in that kind of cases, maybe better off to put a little helper text next to the field instead.
Or use a tooltip.
Oh yeah. All right. Okay, so now we've covered that. Let's look at a bit more involved example with enabling and disabling buttons to indicate application state. Well, that sounds mighty complicated, Dr. Rolf. Could you please explain that to us?
Yeah, so the thing is that in a lot of applications, you want to indicate the state of your data somehow. For example, in this made-up example here, we have what is called something that is called a master detail view, which consists of a list of items that you can select from and a form below it where you can modify the data of that item and create new ones. Yeah,
so I don't know, those buttons are nicely enabled there. Just keep them like that, right? That's no problem.
Yeah, that's exactly the problem, because they don't really if you keep all the buttons that perform actions on the data enabled all the time, the user is kind of missing out on the state information of the form. So if we go through a few different states that this form can be in, and look at what the buttons are not telling you.
Yeah.
So first of all, here we have an item selected and well, we haven't made any changes to its data. So obviously we don't have any unsaved changes. So, but of course there's no way to tell by looking at the UI because all the buttons are enabled. Now, if we do make some changes, now we do have unsaved changes. So we would like to either save or revert those changes, presumably. But again, since the application is not indicating this in any way, you don't know if you have unsaved changes or not.
Nope.
And then if you click the save button and save your changes, well, again, there's no indication of that anything has happened. The save button is still enabled, so you don't really know if the changes have been successfully saved.
Yeah, and what you'll see often in applications that behave like this, that users will just randomly click the save button just to be sure, maybe click it multiple times, I don't know, did it catch, did it hold, I don't know, just click often.
Especially with web applications, sometimes you just can't be sure.
Yeah.
So, okay, another situation is where you have a validation error on a field. Let's say it's a required field that doesn't have a value. So, obviously, clicking the save button here would result in an invalid action. So, we'd have to catch that and display an error message or something.
That's the error messages.
Yeah, but it's kind of why do you keep that save button enabled at all?
Yeah.
And likewise, if you don't have any item selected at all in the list above, then obviously you can't save anything, you can't revert anything, or you can't delete anything because you can't do anything with nothing.
I think in that case we should just throw a null pointer exception, right? that seems right.
Yeah, that's the elegant solution. Yeah. Throw a null pointer exception. Now, well, what you can do instead, and this is really simple to do, is that you can actually toggle the disabled state of the buttons, which actions are actually possible to do at that point.
Yeah.
So let's go through the same states again. First of all, we have the no unsaved changes. Well, we can easily indicate that by simply disabling the save button and the revert button because there's nothing to save and there's nothing to revert.
Yeah, saving or reverting doesn't make any sense in this case, really.
Yeah. If you do make some changes, you should enable those buttons. And when those buttons light up, when they become enabled, this gives the user immediate feedback that, hey, now you made some changes, you might want to save them.
Exactly.
And when you click the save button, the save and revert buttons should become disabled again because you should indicate to the user that, well, successfully saved.
Yeah, it's all about immediate feedback to the user's actions.
Yeah. Now, if you do have a validation error, obviously you should disable the save button, but keep the revert button enabled because you can't save a form that is not valid.
Yeah, and so you should make your text input here, you should make it immediate so that you can do the validation already before the user even tries to click save, and then you can disable the save button.
Yeah.
And not have to pop up some nasty error message.
Exactly, yeah. Again, if you don't have any item selected at all in the table, obviously all the buttons should be disabled.
Yeah, because, well, there's nothing to do. So
exactly.
There you go.
So this is a very easy way, a very subtle way of giving the user a lot of information about the state of the application without showing any annoying pop-up messages or anything like that.
Yeah. All right. So next up, how to choose wisely between disabled and read-only. So we've been looking at enabled versus disabled, but hey, there's also a read-only on Vaadin. What is that for?
Yeah, so a lot of developers using Vaadin are a bit confused about what the difference between read-only and disabled is, because they sound like they would do pretty much the same thing. Well, this is not quite the case. What you see here are three states of the same input field. The first, the normal state. In the middle, we have a disabled state. On the right, we have the read-only state. As you can see, visually, these are very different. The disabled field is semi-transparent or grayed out, while the read-only field doesn't really look like an input field at all. It looks like a label, and it's very easy to read.
Yeah, so hey, maybe we could easy to read. Maybe we could use that somehow, right?
Exactly. That's really the hint. Easy to read or not easy to read. So read-only should be used for displaying fields in presentation mode, where you don't want the user to make any modifications to the data, you just want to present the data. This can be useful if you have a form that can be toggled between a read-only mode and an editable mode, because then you don't have to swap all the input fields for labels. Instead, you can just use the same input fields but put them into read-only mode. So that's what we see here. On the left, we have a form in read-only mode where each of the values looks like a label. It's very easy to read and is uncluttered by the so-called chrome of the input fields, the buttons and the borders and so on. And then when you toggle the form into edit mode, you switch off read-only for each of the fields and they become normal input fields.
Yeah, and imagine now, for example, that here on the left you would have used disabled. Well,
yeah,
you would hardly be able to read it. And you can just look, for example, the buttons at the bottom there,
yeah,
very faded out. That's not what disabled is meant for. That's what you should use read-only for.
Yeah.
And that's really nice here with read-only, is that you can basically just make this view once and then just toggle the read-only state, and that's it. You don't have to actually build two separate views in Vaadin.
Exactly.
For this. Yeah, but unfortunately, read-only has its little caveat.
Quirk.
Yeah, so it's also read-only in your code. So if you are going to try to change the value where something is read-only, you will get a read-only exception. So in that case, so that you see the code here, well, don't do it like that. You should set read-only false, then put your value there, and then set read-only true again after that if you don't want this to happen to you.
Yeah.
And if you don't, it will.
Yeah. Now, disable, on the other hand, disable can be interpreted in two ways. First of all, we have not applicable. So basically, in this example here, we have a question in a form that asks if you have been using Vaadin to develop web applications. And if you choose the no radio button, then obviously the how many years drop down next to the yes radio button is kind of, it's not applicable. It doesn't apply to your answer because you haven't been using Vaadin. So it should be disabled. Whereas if you click the yes radio button, you should enable that drop down because now it is applicable.
Yeah, and I mean, imagine now, for example, in this particular form, that when you've selected no, the 5 years is still enabled. That just invites the user to choose a value there, but it's pointless because the value is not going to be used.
Exactly.
And for example, if we would have used read-only here, let's say that the default is 5, like here, and then it just says no, and the other option is yes for 5 years. Well, I have used Vaadin, but not for 5 years. What do I choose? Yeah. You're just confusing your users that way. Or if it was read-only, or God forbid, you would hide the field, it just says yes, Vaadin for years. Well, yeah, okay, I have used Vaadin for years and years, but that might not apply to everybody, so think about that. Yeah. Use disabled. All right, the other case where we use disabled.
Well, the other case where we should use disabled if field or button currently cannot be used. So, as an example, you might have a form where one of the fields can only be changed by users with different permissions than you have. So in this case, the priority field here can only be modified by project managers. So we still want to show the user that there is a priority field, but we don't want to let them to modify it. Now, so disabled makes sense here because the field is still visible, but it's clearly not usable. If we had used read-only here instead, we would just have the caption priority with a blank space beneath it. Because in read-only mode, an empty field is just a blank space. So it would be a bit confusing not to see a component there.
Yeah, and I'll also notice here that because it's disabled, we can put a tooltip here, but the thing is, because it's disabled, the users intuitively still understands that they can put their mouse over that and get the tooltip with the explanation, whereas if you have a read-only, it's just text. You're not expecting tooltips to come out of text. So that's why we use also disabled here. And also disabled gives you the sense like at some point it can be enabled somehow. And the tooltip here explains how that is done. And and then the final thing is here, like you were talking about permissions, like we are allowed to do that or not. If this kind of user shouldn't even know that there's priority, of course we're just going to hide it altogether.
Obviously.
So think carefully about what is the case in your application. All right, well, that's all we've have to say for our part. Yeah. Let's go do a little bit of questions and answers. All right, let's have a look. So, I'm waiting for the question to come on the screen.
It's currently blank.
Yeah.
We had the questions here just a moment ago.
Okay, so, well, while we're waiting for the questions, I don't know, we already kind of looked through them. All right, so...
Let's try reloading.
And there we go. Okay,
We have the questions.
Okay, so there we go. All right, Andrea is asking, what is the best components to mix together in order to develop a data list with CRUD operations? Well, what can we say about that?
Well, it's a pretty open-ended question, but usually when you have a CRUD application, it's usually quite similar to some of the examples that we showed you here today. That is a master detail view with a list at the top or on the left, and then a form where we can modify the data below or to the right.
Yeah, so you think of the example where we showed with the enabled and disabled buttons. That is a pretty good example of how you can do a CRUD application.
So as for the components, I mean, you would probably want to use usually a table or a grid for the listing itself. Then just whatever combination of input fields that is appropriate for the data that you want to modify.
Yeah, and then Andrea has another question. What's the best setup for a combo box with a large data set? Well, the combo box should be able to handle large data sets out of the box, right?
Yeah, the combo box is designed exactly for that purpose. So I don't think you really need to, there's no configuration you really need to do in order to handle large data sets.
So just use as is.
Yeah.
All right, next question from Guttorm. In an editable table, you don't want a caption for each individual field. So what do you then do with the required and error markers? Well, you don't actually need a caption for those.
No. When a field is in an error state, as well as required, it already gets style names applied to it. And depending on your theme, those style names might actually change the appearance of the field. So in the Valo theme, for example, the error state gives the field a red border and I think a pinkish background color instead of white. Mm-hmm. So you don't necessarily need a caption to indicate errors. As for required, you would have to theme that yourself with CSS, but it's not really a big deal.
No. All right, then Guttorm has another question. Oh, that's a long one. Let me read that out loud here. Form layout is fine until you need multiple columns. When you need multiple columns, you might also need the column span for some fields. So, putting multiple form layouts next to each other is just not flexible enough. Well, I hate to have to bring it to you, but form layout is just not very flexible.
It's not very flexible.
So, so next you might try grid layout, he says, but then you don't get the label to the left of the field. Well, I wouldn't try grid layout next. I wouldn't recommend that. I would go for a combination of vertical and horizontal layouts, or if your needs are very specific, I would use a CSS layout, and then you can very easily, again, use CSS to choose reposition the caption on the left.
Yeah.
And he's saying, well, or you might put the caption in a separate label. Yeah, sure, that's a good option too.
Yeah.
That leaves the field with no caption. What about the error mark? Well, like we just explained, you
do get an error style, not the error icon, but you get a red border around the field and so on. With the Valo theme, at least.
Yeah, and you can make your own style that has an icon if you without what you prefer. Basically, that's entirely possible. All right, next up, Marco is asking: we are trying to create a responsive web app with a friendly UI for desktop, tablet, phone usage. So I want to cover all of those. How to handle too much pop-ups on touch or small-sized devices? Well, I think you said it yourself already, too much pop-ups, so don't use pop-ups basically there.
Just have, separate views for sub-views instead of pop-ups. So pop-ups just don't work that well on mobile devices.
No. So what you do is, when you do your action, you open a separate view for where you would have used pop-up or something like that. Then when you finish, the user finishes doing whatever they need to do there, then you return to the previous view, or you continue to another view, etc. So just make separate views for everything. Yeah,
and I would say that's a totally valid approach even for normal web applications. Not just mobile.
Sure, yeah, definitely. All right, next up, Aaron is asking, how to decide between using table and grid.
Yeah, well, they both have their advantages and disadvantages. They have different feature sets, so you'll just have to compare the features that each component has and figure out which are most important to you.
Yeah, in general, I would say that by default, you should probably use grid, but I think there's like some things that you can't do yet with grid, and then you want to choose table.
Yeah, the current version of the grid doesn't have all the functionality that is planned for it yet. So.
Yeah, so just study the API, I think. That's the answer. All right, next up, Domitian is saying, I use Vaadin 6, old school user. I have a huge table with 30 plus columns, and in older browsers, rendering takes a long time. How can I reduce that? Well, first of all, don't put labels in your table, right? Just put plain text. You can put strings straight into the table. That's much, much faster than putting labels there. If you have custom components,
or any components really inside the table.
Yeah, but any component. Yeah, any component that you can just replace with plain text, do that. But also, for example, get rid of unnecessary nesting. So if you have the custom component class that wraps the component in something else, there you have a layout around something. Like it's any kind of nesting that you can get rid of, any kind of components you can get rid of, just to make it as light as possible, and that will improve your performance, often quite dramatically.
Also, 30 plus columns sounds kind of like a lot out of usability perspective, and of course we have no idea what this application looks like. No. But I would consider trying to figure out if there's some way to reduce the number of columns that you need to have there.
Yeah, because also from a usability point of view, having 30 columns, it doesn't sound very good. So try to really, maybe you should only, like if we consider, for example, master detail view, like we were talking about already. So those columns, just put just enough to what is really important for the user, really matters, just enough to identify the objects basically, and maybe tell what kind of state they're in. And then when you click on them, then you do a detail view. And then, for example, if you're a mobile, you could open that in a separate view like we were just talked about. Or if you're making the traditional desktop application, you can just put them side by side.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, next up, Ville is asking, how would you do that field grouping on the Java side? Haha, okay, so now we're talking about our first example, where we are, what wasn't the first, but one of the very first. So we're grouping the fields together. Well, the trick here is to use set margin and set spacing. So for each group, I'm going to wrap that in a separate layout. And then, for example, I can, on those individual layouts, I can just set margin and they will have extra space around them.
Or you just set spacing on the layout that contains all of these layouts, in which case it will generate spacing elements between.
Yeah, but so both approaches are valid, but really the main point is, so you have one, parent layout, and then for each group you have its own layout. And then you can either put spacing between them or margins around the child elements. Here's another question. Any tips on how to track possible changes on the Java side when toggling button states? So now we're talking about whether something should be disabled or enabled, I think.
Yeah. Well, so unfortunately you will have to do some coding of your own here, because there's no built-in way to handle that in Vaadin easily. However, it's not really a big deal. You just the important thing is to make sure that your input fields are set to immediate.
Yes.
So that they immediately communicate to the server that their value has changed.
Yeah, and in some cases you might also need to put set buffered false. That and so then you can process immediately the feedback that comes from changing the fields. And then you just have to rely on your own logic to probably enable or disable certain buttons.
Yeah, basically use value change listeners and similar mechanisms to trigger changes, trigger these button state changes whenever a value changes.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's best practices for that in coding, but that's kind of more like a programming topic, not the UX topic. So maybe if you need help with that, ask around on the forums. That's a good place. Finally, we have Marco with a question about read-only mode for presentation mode. Right, so remember that this, we showed the form that you can toggle between edit and read-only. What if the form contains a lot of select, radio buttons, and checkbox components? Well, you need to do a little bit more work there, but you need to write a little bit of custom CSS, because, for example, if we looked at the beginning when Rolf showed the slide of we have the normal version, the disabled version, the read-only version, you could already notice that the combo box, when it was read-only, the text was actually a little bit indented when you would like to align it really with the caption. And that kind of little things, you'll just have to write some CSS to fix that basically. And that's, I think that's the most elegant way to do it basically.
Yeah, also when it comes to things like checkboxes and radio buttons, sometimes it might be better to, instead of just switching the components to read-only mode, to actually replace them with a label that says something.
Yeah.
Sometimes read-only, switching to read-only is not the optimal solution from a usability point of view.
Yeah, so read-only is a good place to start, real time saver, but then you just have to, override that basically with other means when you need to do so.
Yeah.
All right, the next question by Nemanja. What about the always present issue of printing layouts? Should you make a separate printing view for every view?
Yeah, I mean, printing a Vaadin view is kind of awkward. I mean, it's not really what it's meant for. It's kind of like printing an application UI. So I would say that if you need to if you need to make something for print, if you need to generate printable content.
Perhaps I wouldn't even use Vaadin for that. I'd use a separate library to generate a PDF or something like that.
Or an HTML, normal HTML document.
Sure, yeah. So not so easy out of the box, not what Vaadin was intended for.
However, if you do need to do it with Vaadin to save time, for example, you can use print media CSS style sheets to basically make things look a bit nicer when printed. So
you can have separate styles that only apply when you're trying to print the page. Yeah. All right. Next question by Eric. On toggling enabled states of button when editing a form, are there any plans to support this better in Vaadin? And then there's a lot more text. We're trying to follow this pattern when we're having the following difficulties. Tricky to implement at the moment using field group. Requires a server round trip when every field change. Causes a lot of progress bar flashes. Particularly bad listening to text change events. Ideally, we'd like to see it built into the field group API and also have an option of carrying out client-side web validation. Well, there's one thing that helps. There's the Snappy add-on, which allows you to have event listeners on the client side. You might want to look into that so you can immediately respond to things. That saves you a round trip when you don't need one. Other than that, are there any plans?
I don't know, frankly.
We are not in R&D.
No. I would like to see a simpler solution for this myself.
For sure, yeah.
Absolutely.
So hey, whenever you want to see something like this, check out on dev.vaadin.com if there is a feature request for this already. If you can't find one, just request a feature by all means. If it's important to you, you can file the ticket and then you can see if it gets scheduled, and if someone is working on it, so you can keep track of that. So I would really encourage you, if anytime you want to see features or you think we want something fixed, whatever, go to dev.vaadin.com and file a ticket.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that it? I guess we don't have any more questions. All right. Thank you for listening. If you have any more questions, I encourage you to go to vaadin.com and click on the community tab. We have a wiki there and it has a UX section where a lot of this content and even more is explained in more detail. A lot of good stuff written by Rolf over here. If you have any more questions besides that, just also in the community tab, go to the forum and just ask your questions there, and I'm sure there'll be someone able to answer them for you. All right, that's it for us for now. I'm Marlon, Richert, designer at Vaadin.
I'm Rolf, Smeds, designer at Vaadin.
Signing off. Thank you and good night.